Hey, everybody, welcome to our third class on the subject of just mercy, justice, and the people of God. And let me give you a reminder that one of the primary sources that I'm using is Timothy Keller's book, Generous Justice. I highly recommend it. Encourage you to buy it and spend some time reading what he has to say and meditating upon it. You'll hear some of the same things in these classes, but he goes into greater detail and he's just an excellent writer. So far, we've talked about what it means to do justice, as it says in Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. To walk humbly with God is to do justice and love mercy. Justice is the action. Mercy is the motivation behind the action. And I hope we've seen in this call for justice, or for mishpat, as the Hebrew word is that this is much more than just punishing the wrongdoer. Mishpat, or justice in Scripture, is giving people what they're due, whether it's punishment or it's protection and care. And so in this lesson, and it permeates the Old Testament. I mean, obviously, it's just everywhere, especially when it talks about defending the vulnerable in society, the poor, the needy, the widow, the orphan, the alien in your midst. I mean, the Bible, Old Testament, could not be clearer that this is something that God expects his people to do. This is not a token thing. This is at the very heart and center of what it means to be a child of God. And so that's the Old Testament. Well, what about the New Testament? So today, we're going to get my bill over here. Today, the third lesson is going to be justice and the New Testament. And so I guess I just want to start off by asking, did Jesus care for the vulnerable people around him in his society? I mean, maybe a better way to say is, how did he interact with them, or how big a part of his ministry were these people? Well, when you study the Gospels, what you find is that Jesus has an intense interest in and love for the same kind of vulnerable people that are spoken of in the Old Testament. When John the Baptist's disciples came to him and said, John wants to know if you're the Messiah. He wants to know if you're the one that's supposed to be the coming one, if you're Messiah. This is what Jesus said in Matthew 11, verses 4 and 5. You go back and you report to John what you hear and see. Okay, this is what tells you whether or not Messiah is here. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those with who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Now, I'll tell you, good news is the way we think of good news, but what would good news be to a poor person? Well, certainly it would be that their sins were forgiven. But what would really be good news for a poor person is that they're not poor anymore, that their poverty will be alleviated. So Jesus' stated mission here, it's much more. And I think for a multitude of reasons, we tend to focus in on this one area. But Jesus' stated mission is much more than just spiritual salvation, so that we'll have pie in the sky by and by. Jesus' mission was a call to create the same kind of just society that was talked about in the Old Testament. And so while clearly Jesus was preaching the good news to all, he showed throughout his ministry a particular interest in the poor and the oppressed, just as God has always had that kind of interest. What kind of people are we talking about? Well, you can just flip through the pages of the Gospels. I'm going to go through these really quick, but you can write them down as we go, or you can call me and or shoot me an email and I'll send you my notes so you can look at these in greater detail. But I'm going to just mention some. In Matthew chapter 9, it says that Jesus was at the tax collector's Matthew's home, and this was after Matthew was called to be a disciple, and there were all kinds of sinful people there. And so people that were ostracized from society, tax collectors and other sinners. That's who Jesus spent time with. In Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 16, he raises the son of a poor widow, raises her son from the dead, showing particular tenderness and attention to this woman who would now have been on her own and would have been destitute in the street. In Luke 7, verses 36 and following, that very familiar passage of the prostitute, the immoral woman who comes in and into the party and cries on Jesus' feet and washes his feet with her tears and dries his feet with her hair and anoints his feet with oil. Jesus did not turn that woman away. He wanted her to be in his presence. In John chapter 4, verse 27, the Samaritan woman, Jesus spoke with a woman in public, not only a woman, but a Samaritan, something that a man with any standing in his society at that time would not have done. Jesus challenged the racism and the sexism that existed in his culture. In Luke chapter 10, verse 26, we have the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus, and again, he's refusing to go along with the racism in his culture. He made a hated Samaritan the hero of what is probably his most famous parable. This was some of the Jews, especially the leaders, this was blowing their heads. They couldn't believe that Jesus would say this kind of stuff. In Luke chapter 4, Jesus touched off a riot because he claimed that God loved the Gentiles, like the widow of Zarephath and Naaman the Syrian, just as much as the Jews, and in fact could use them to do great things, just as God had used the Jews, and they rioted because of that. In Luke chapter 18, verse 15, he wants the children to come to him, a marginalized section of society that had no rights. His disciples didn't think they were worth his time, but Jesus brought them into his presence. In Mark chapter 1, verse 41, Luke 5, verse 13, and several other passages, Jesus reached out to and touched and healed lepers. Lepers were some of the ultimate outcasts in society. In Mark 12, verses 42 through 43, Jesus praised a widow for her. This is the widow's mite story. Jesus praises this widow who puts in these 2 little copper coins and calls his disciples to give to the poor in the strongest possible ways, in extravagant ways. In John 1, verse 53, Mary, the mother of Jesus, in Mary's song prophesied, he will fill the poor. In Luke 19, verses 1 through 10, we have the story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector. And here Jesus is showing true justice by eating and speaking with a tax collector. The wealthiest people in his society at that time were tax collectors, but they were also the most hated because the way they acquired their money was by collaborating with Roman forces, the Roman forces of occupation in Palestine. In Luke chapter 2, the first witness to Jesus' birth were shepherds. Now, shepherds were a despised group in the Old Testament. They were not at the pinnacle of society. They were down at the very bottom just because of the nature of their work. And then Luke chapter 24, verse 1 and following, the first witnesses of Jesus' resurrection were women, another class of people that's so marginalized in society, and this is why this is important. They were so marginalized in society that their testimony was not admissible evidence in court. So who were the first ones to see the resurrection? It was the women. Look at Jesus' directions to his followers regarding the poor in Luke 14. He says, when you give a luncheon or dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers and sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. I mean, if you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Now, this is really important because in Jesus' day, society operated largely on what was called a patronage system. Really, we kind of work that way today as well. The people with resources created influence networks by opening their doors and giving resources to people who in turn provided business opportunities and political favors. Does that sound familiar at all? In this kind of a culture, banquets were necessary. And I'll tell you something else, they were expensive, but they paid off because that was the way business was done. Dinners were ways to sustain and reward current patronage relationships, and also they were opportunities for creating new patronage relationships. That's why the only people you invited to your dinners and to your banquets were your own peers and your existing relations and your rich neighbors and those with whom you did business. I mean, that's the way business was done. And so let me tell you what this means. So people who were listening to this in the first century, when they heard Jesus say this in Luke chapter 14, they would have said, Jesus, what you're suggesting is economic and social suicide. Jesus commanded his disciples that they share their homes and build relationships not with people from their own social class or higher who would profit them, but with people who were poor and without influence who could never pay back any money or favor that was given to them. Now, he's not saying that you can't eat with your friends or your peers or your family or your business partners. He's not saying that. He's talking about the importance of creating a just society. So what Jesus does is he very bluntly, strongly contradicts the spirit and practice of the patronage system of the day. And he takes it even a step further. He tells his disciples to if they're going to give without expecting repayment. He says that in Luke chapter 6. If you give, you lend, don't expect anything in return. And then he said, if possible, in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, he says, if you do give, do it so that no one can see you do it. Because you're not doing it so people will think well of you. You don't get anything out of this. You're just trying to help the poor and help people. The patronage system, very much like what we have today in our world, was characterized by neither compassion or justice. It did not unite a society that was divided by class and race. It sustained the status quo. And Jesus comes in and his ethic of love attacked this world system at its root. And that's what we're called to do as well. Here's another passage, Luke chapter 12, verse 33. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. In Matthew 19:21 and Luke 18:22, he tells famously a rich young ruler to sell all he has, all of his possessions, and to give to the poor and to follow him. Now, I don't think that wasn't a universal rule. Jesus spent time with rich people, and there were rich people, especially rich women, who supported his ministry. So I don't think this is some type of universal rule. But here is, I think, the point. I think his point is that the believers should not see any of their money as their own, and that they should be profoundly involved with and generous to the poor. So the question is, well, did Jesus care for the vulnerable? Yes, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, Jesus was operating in the grand tradition of the prophets. Jesus shared the Old Testament's zeal for the cause of the vulnerable. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Micah, they all leveled this charge that religion is useless unless it is accompanied by the practice of justice. In other words, religious practice is useless. God will not hear it. He will not see it. It benefits nothing if it is not also connected with and accompanied by the practice of mishpat, of justice, of caring for the outcast. Look at Isaiah 1, verses 15 through 17. When you spread your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I am not listening. Why? Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Okay, God, how do we do that? He says, you seek justice. That's mishpat. You defend the oppressed. You take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow. Later on in Isaiah 58, we've looked at this before, 2 weeks ago, I think. Isaiah tells them, is not this the kind of fasting I've chosen? Again, fasting was a religious activity. They were fasting, but it was not accompanied with justice. And so it wasn't doing them any good except maybe helping them lose weight. God says, is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. The point is not that justice needs to be just one more thing you add to your religious portfolio. A lack of justice is a sign that the worshipers' hearts are not right with God at all. That's a strong statement, but that's exactly the case the prophets make. I said last week, I think that we don't know the Old Testament very well, and we really don't. If we would understand that this justice thing, whether you want to call it social justice or whatever else, that this is right at the heart of who God is. And Jesus' criticism of the religious leaders in Mark 12 was identical to the criticism that was leveled through Isaiah to the rich people of his day. In Mark 12, 38 and 40, Jesus says, you watch out for the teachers of the law. He's talking about the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. Such men will be punished most severely. So behind their excessive religious observances are lives that are insensitive to the vulnerable populations around them. That's who these people were. They were religious people. They knew the Bible. They knew it frontwards and backwards. They were lawyers in biblical law. They could quote you chapter and verse, but they were insensitive to the vulnerable classes in their world. And if you are insensitive to the vulnerable, you don't know God and you don't know grace. Because I'll tell you, if you're touched by grace, you must do justice. You must do the justice. The teaching from a teaching from Jesus that most closely and directly links to Isaiah 1 and Isaiah 58 is probably the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew chapter 25. And I'm not going to read all of that because you know what it is. Jesus compares Judgment Day to the task of shepherds who separate out the sheep from the goats in the flock. And on that day, there are going to be a lot of people who claim to have believed in Jesus, who he will reject. His true sheep, he insists in this passage, have a heart for the least of these, which Jesus defined in the parable as the hungry, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the imprisoned. And his point is that disciples of Jesus, disciples of Christ, will create a new community that does not exclude the poor. It does not exclude members of other races. It does not exclude the powerless. And it deals with their needs sacrificially and practically. Now, let me show you something interesting. In Matthew 25, verse 36, he says, I was sick and you looked after me. Okay. Some versions say you cared for me or you visited me. Do you know what that word is? That word for looked after, cared for, visited? It's the word episkopos. It's where we get our word for bishop or overseer in the church, a leader in the church. This is stunning because when we think about a guy being an overseer, we think of a boss, somebody who's in charge. And that's not the idea that comes through Scripture at all. An episkopos is the person that looks after people. The episkopos is the person who cares for people. The episkopos are those who visit people, who take care of their needs. Now, this is the kind of community that Jesus said his true disciples would establish. And here's something else. Jesus did not say in Matthew 25 that all this stuff is done for the poor and for those who are marginalized as a means of gaining salvation. Rather, what he says is that this is what saved people naturally do. No heart that loves Christ can be cold to the vulnerable and the needy. Let's think a moment about the Sermon on the Mount, because we can't pass this up. Y'all know the Sermon on the Mount. It's so famous. It has prohibitions against sexual lust in the heart, adultery, and divorce. But there are also calls to give to the poor in Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, to refrain from overwork and materialism in Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 and following. And what Jesus does is he weaves together private morality and social justice. Now, in Western society, these sets of concerns are usually split off from one another. In fact, we'll talk politics again. In fact, each of America's two main political parties has built its platform on one of these sets of ethical prescriptions to the near exclusion of the other. I'll tell you what I mean. Conservatism stresses the importance of personal morality, especially the importance of traditional sexual mores and hard work, and feels that the liberal charges of racism and social injustice are overblown. I'm not a racist. On the other hand, liberalism stresses social justice and considers conservative emphases on moral virtue to be prudish at best and psychologically harmful at worst. And here's the thing. Each side regards the other with smug self-righteousness. The churches in America are often more controlled by the surrounding political culture than by the spirit of Jesus and the prophets. Conservative churches tend to concentrate on one set of sins. Liberal churches seem to concentrate on another set of sins. But Jesus, like the Old Testament prophets, does not see two categories of morality. I'll give you an example. Amos 2, verse 7. They're talking to Israel. They trample, this is the charge against God's people. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground and deny justice to the oppressed. Father and son use the same girl and so profane my holy name. Use the same girl, you know what he's talking about there. What Amos does is he condemns social injustice and sexual sin in virtually the same breath. The biblical perspective sees sexual immorality and material selfishness as both flowing from self-centeredness rather than God-centeredness. Okay, well, that's the Gospels, and that's Jesus. And let's talk about a moment about the early church, their perspective. The Apostle Paul viewed ministry to the poor as so important that it was the last thing he admonished the Ephesian church to do before he left them for the last time. In Acts chapter 20, and we focused often on Acts chapter 20, verse 28, where it lays out be shepherds of the church of God over which the Spirit has made you overseers. I mean, that's one of our candy cane verses in the New Testament to show how the church ought to be organized. Well, the last thing Paul said in that dialogue with the Ephesian elders and the Ephesian church was this. Acts 20, verse 35. He said, in everything I did when I was with you, in everything I did, I showed you that by this kind of hard work, we must help the weak. Remembering the words of the Lord Jesus himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Now, I would suggest, as I'm suggesting on Sunday mornings right now, that you don't use your last words without saying something that is all important to you. It's just all important. And for Paul, it's this. Don't just preach. Help the weak. Help the poor. It's interesting, at the beginning of the pandemic, I have a picture, and if one of you want to look at it, you can. It's of a protester, I want to say in Kentucky, Tennessee, somewhere. But she's holding up a sign. There's a woman behind her that's holding up an American flag. But this woman's holding up a sign that says, sacrifice the weak. And I thought to me, I wonder if she's a Christian. Because if she is, she doesn't even understand what it means to be a Christian. We don't sacrifice the weak. We help the weak. The New Testament writers recognized the concern for justice and mercy in the Old Testament, and they applied it to the church community in a variety of ways. We'll look at a couple of them. This one I mentioned last week. Paul says wrote the Corinthian church, asked them for an offering to relieve starving Christians in Palestine. And he says at the present time, he references the picking up of manna, the harvesting of manna, if you will, when God would send manna to the Israelites, and some could gather better than others. No one could hoard, no one could gather more than they needed, so that everybody got the same. And so Paul says in 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 14, at the present time, your plenty will supply their need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what you need. Then there will be equality. What Paul did not say was, you know what? Those Palestinian Jews, they should have better prepared themselves. There's always the possibility that a famine will happen. There's always a possibility that something will go on like that. So you got to take steps. And if you don't take the time to take steps, then bad on you. Does that sound familiar at all? The New Testament book of James contains some of the most severe condemnations of those who keep their wealth to themselves and exploit the workers in their midst. James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. And because of that, in context, he says it's the wrath of God that's coming to you. And I would suggest to you that James 5, 1 through 6 could have been lifted right from Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, or any number of the other prophets. Let's look at the book of Acts a second. You know these passages. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. What these people did in Acts 2 was they helped the needy. Look at Acts chapter 4. All the believers were one in heart and mind, and no one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything that they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. Now, you would think that what Luke would write is that the Holy Spirit, or that God's grace was so powerfully at work in them that they converted many, many more people. But that's not what he says. He says God's grace was so powerfully at work in them that there were no needy persons among them. Why? From time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. And then it says Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field he owned and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. And I think these vignettes from the early life of the church are important. Remember that their Bible was the Old Testament. They didn't have the book of Acts yet. They didn't have the letters of the New Testament. They didn't have the Gospels. All they had was the Old Testament. And I want you to remember that a key text in the Old Testament is Deuteronomy 15, verse 4, that says that if they would obey God, no permanent poverty could exist in their midst. There should be no poor among you. Now, this was the pinnacle of social righteousness legislation in the Old Testament. It expressed God's love for the vulnerable and his zeal to see poverty and want eliminated. And so when in Acts 4, verse 34, Luke says there were no needy persons among them. I don't think that's an accident. Now, he's lifting these words almost as a direct quote out of Deuteronomy chapter 15. In Deuteronomy, believers were called to open their hands to the needy as far as there was need, until people became self-sufficient. Deuteronomy 15 verses 7 and 8, if anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God has given you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Compare that verse to 1 John 3, 16 and 17. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? You say, well, that's just the Old Testament, Dave, or that's just the people of God. It's not the alien sinners. Well, I mean, we've clearly demonstrated that the church and Jesus went out of their way to help the alien, the sinner, the outcast, the marginalized, the poor, the widow. And so it's not surprising to hear Paul say this in Galatians 6, verse 10. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of God. This is both and, not either or. As you have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. One of the four vulnerable classes that are protected by the Hebrew prophets are the immigrants. The foreigners who resided in Israel, they could convert if they wanted to, but the command to provide them with shelter and to guard their legal rights was not qualified by whether or not they entered the covenant of Moses or not. That showed that Israel's justice and compassion was not just to be confined to only its own believing community. And that's going to be illustrated powerfully next week when we focus on justice and our neighbor. Who is our neighbor? We'll talk about that next week. I hope you're enjoying the class. God bless you.